Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucy Fisher, and I am the Defence Editor at The Times. I'm delighted that there's a session dedicated today to the subject of defence in Britain and Europe on the agenda of this excellent conference, because it seems to me that the UK's post-Brexit defence relationship with the European Union is an area that has been, relatively speaking, starved of attention in the swirling public discourse about the UK's departure from the EU. In some respects, of course, that's for an obvious reason. Defence is not an EU competence, but member states do cooperate in many important respects, including, of course, on joint military deployments and research into defence technologies. We've had input from both sides in recent weeks and months talking up the appetite for continued cooperation, and that is promising up to a point. But the legal framework that would govern Britain's potential future involvement in EU-led initiatives, such as the European Defence Fund and the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, remain unclear. It's an important issue because the EU moves towards closer defence integration are pressing ahead apace. So far, the PESCO initiative, which aims to develop and deploy forces at the EU level, has lined up 50 projects. Of course, the UK has remained outside PESCO, but wants to keep on the table the possibility of third-party involvement on a project-by-project basis. The European Defence Fund has meanwhile been allocated 13 billion euros to promote cross-border collaboration on defence research and tech programmes, an extra 6.5 billion for the upgrade of roads, bridges, rail and other infrastructure, and an additional 16 billion euros for space initiatives. Obviously, there are parts of all of this that the British government may want to join, and the appetite of UK defence industry is, of course, vigorous. This, of course, must be balanced against the fact that Brexiteer voices remain concerned about a European army, and there's also a valid debate to be had about how some of these European initiatives work with NATO, whether they are a complement or competition to NATO as the primary defence structure. It's a timely moment to discuss all of these issues following Britain's exit from the EU 10 days ago and the transition period we now have until the end of December. And of course, we're about to pitch into the Integrated Foreign Policy, Defence and Security Review. We've got a fantastic panel here who I hope will talk about the potential sweet spots for cooperation between Britain and Europe going forward, as well as potential obstacles. And they'll examine how Britain and the EU might look to restructure their defence policies and resources post-Brexit. So to my right, I have Lord Houghton, a crossbench peer who was, of course, the former Chief of the Defence Staff from 2013 to 2016. And to my left is Angus Lapsley, Director General, Strategy and International at the Ministry of Defence. So I'll ask both of our panellists, and I should probably add that Sophia Besch, Senior Researcher at the Centre for European Reform, who you'll see on your agenda, is unfortunately unable to make it because of Storm Kira and the cancellation of her flight. So I'm going to give both Lord Houghton and Angus 5 minutes or so to give some opening remarks, and then I'm sure we'll all have some probing questions for them.
Being the military chap, I'll stand up. Is this working all right? Yeah, good. And delighted to be here, despite Sophia's absence and my inclusion. I still think it's an impressive panel. So congratulations to Lucy for laying this on. I spoke 2 weeks ago, and I can see some faces who were in that audience at the Global Strategy Forum, on a sort of similar topic. Lucy, very naughtily, turned it into an article on the Tuesday in the Times, or the Monday, and I was on the slopes in Meribel, and people kept skiing up to me and said, "You're in trouble back home." And I realised I'm not in trouble, because I can't really be in trouble with anybody now, which is good. But what Lucy gave us a selective dining experience from what I said at the Global Strategy Forum. I'm going to reprise some of those themes, because I'm an army officer and a constable of the Tower. I'm not a sort of a pop artist that can produce a new song every week. I do firmly believe that any discussion on Britain's role in the world, particularly defence and security, and even if you limit it or try to limit it to Europe, has to start with an intellectually robust assessment of the global strategic context. And I'll offer just 6 observations on that context. Firstly, contrary to many people's views, and the ones that are most peddled perhaps by the media, is that we live in the best of times, not the worst of times, not the most dangerous of times. And I think the bodies of evidence that support the fact that we have never lived in better times when it comes to the overall state of our health, the overall access to food, and the overall absence of violence, the evidence is absolutely there if we want to listen to it. Secondly, perhaps, and this is we don't know whether or not this has happened just for the moment, is that formalised warfare has given way to a different form of interstate activity which you could describe as malicious and insidious competition. Third, I think, and I would say that this is definitely the case in the United Kingdom, but I think throughout Europe, is that domestic security is now more dominant than defence in both the public and the political mind. Fourth, I would completely buy into those who believe that there are some dangerous spoilers around when it comes to the current world order, and perhaps in ascending order of challenge into how those dangerous spoilers are accommodated, I would go Iran, Russia, China. But I would add that I think that there are some even more dangerous megatrends. The megatrends that we're not quite in control of, but actually are more pernicious and dangerous to the human condition on our planet than perhaps things that derive from more formalised state-on-state competition. And I talk about things such as, I would suggest obvious things, such as climate change, such as population growth, the continued maldistribution and wealth and opportunity across the world and between societies. And then finally, I would probably say, it is the residual inequalities of the world that are the most dangerous set of circumstances when it comes both to defence and security. So if that, if you like, is my base case, I will offer from those observations a few thoughts and conclusions. Firstly, that relative peace is not naturally occurring. I think that the relative lack of violence we experience at an interstate level has not come about because of the sort of the teleological certainty of mankind's journey to a peacefully coexistent state. I think it's as it is, for some very good reasons, and to a significant extent, that this is the residual beneficial effects of effective deterrence. And I do believe that continued deterrence is needed to buy time for the resolution of global inequalities, predominantly by diplomats and developers. And by developers, I mean those that deploy development aid to attenuate and moderate some of the worst inequalities on the planet, again buying time and finding localized solutions. The third thing I would say is that we seem unwilling to pay for both security and deterrence. Certainly the last two defence reviews I had anything to do with, if there was any switching of funding, it wasn't the adding in of more, it was the incremental movement from the hollowing out of hard defence into the ability to ameliorate security threats. There does not seem to be a willingness on behalf of government, nor a demand by society to spend more so that we can be effective at both. Security, I think, is politically the non-discretionary element because it so directly affects how secure societies perceive themselves to be, and in a short-term sense is more politically damaging when we get domestic security issues wrong. And then the final thing I would say, perhaps by way of my thoughts, is that we need to be smarter, therefore, about how we deliver deterrence, especially as, in statistical terms, take NATO and Russia, the conventional superior of NATO is absolutely huge. So if all this is right, my sort of base case and some of my deductions, then my contribution to the discussion might be along three lines. Firstly, and I mean here Europe, i.e. the European pillar of NATO, you could add in Canada, but I have huge sympathy for Middle America, who doesn't quite understand, and Mr. Trump has played to this, why they should be spending 3.6 or 7% of the biggest GDP on earth in order to continue to maintain the security of three relatively rich regions, if you say Southeast Asia, the Middle East and Europe. We ought to do more for ourselves in Europe. So Europe needs to make NATO operationally more effective at deterrence. And I mean this to an extent at a nuclear, but primarily at a conventional level. And there are ways in discussion we can talk about that. Secondly, I think that the UK has to sustain, and again it needs Europe to do this, a collective approach to domestic security. But it also needs to improve its own domestic preparedness and the machinery enabled to protect and provide the resilience of the nation in the context which, if deterrence works, will see the continuation of this form of malevolent and insidious interstate activity. And then thirdly, I think there needs to be a greater collective urgency in resolving the megatrend issues, especially climate change, population growth, and human inequality. But primarily, these are political, diplomatic, and international institutions are the only people that can do this. This should not be the default utility of defence. So if I was to think of a sort of a provocative summary of that, Britain needs to stop being a militarily nostalgic and institutionally underfunded, delusional hard power nation. Instead, it needs to be a diplomatic development thought leader and an exemplar of professional military collectivism. And I say that because, and I put it that way because although the British Armed Forces remain remarkably sort of robust, their morale intact and all that, they are undoubtedly, to an extent, I feel, particularly at the middle to higher levels of leadership, infected by an understanding that the country doesn't really understand what they're for. They gather the nation's sympathy rather than its active and intelligent support. And the leadership knows most of the battles it fights are in Whitehall for money rather than its enemies. And when you are institutionally continuously underfunded, this is not a sensible place to be, and there is far greater operational and life reward to be drawn from being properly established and funded to do a meaningful job along the lines that I hope a redefinition of our place in the world and our security relationship with Europe might provide.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you, everyone, and for this invitation. My profession is definitely a sedentary one, so I will stay here. I will apologise in advance if I start coughing. Please be reassured this is a fully sovereign British cough. It has no foreign influences in it whatsoever, and I certainly can get into trouble. So I will have to be careful about some things. But I'm going to start really where General Nick left off, because as he alluded, we are going to have an integrated review of foreign policy and defence policy in government over the next couple of months. And that'll have a big defence component to it. And also I can't predict now exactly where it will come out, but I would be absolutely gobsmacked if it didn't conclude pretty early on in the process that the security of Europe remains central and fundamental to the security of Britain. Nothing that's happened in British politics over the last couple of years change that. I would also be quite gobsmacked if it didn't conclude, again to pick up a theme that General Nick was elaborating, that actually the way in which we deliver security and the way in which we deliver defence effect will have to carry on becoming even more internationalised. That the number of things that the UK can aspire to do on its own, or indeed that any country can aspire to do on its own, including the very biggest, is really reduces by the year. So how we design capability, how we design how we would fight, our doctrine, our defence and deterrence postures, all these things just become ever more internationalised. So with those kind of two predictions, let me say something about the way in which I think we will approach this question of what is Britain's role in European defence and European security. I would make, my first proposition would be, and I don't think this will shock anyone when I say it, that it is still fundamentally about NATO. That is the primary and the organising structure for certainly defence in Europe. You can have a slightly broader debate if you talk about security in Europe. For defence in Europe, NATO undoubtedly remains the most important organisation. And a lot of our national defence effort, I predict, will continue to go into making NATO effective, both at defence and at deterrent. So there is a big agenda around delivery. We've done some good things in recent years, like enhanced forward presence forces in the Baltic countries. We're tackling some really quite demanding things like readiness at the moment. Even for a military like the UK, making sure that we have the right forces that can move, to use a military a bit of jargon, at the speed of relevance to where they need to get to in the NATO area of operations. That is demanding and requires real investment after 20 years of counterinsurgency operations. Because Nick is absolutely right that NATO, on paper, has conventional superiority, but the issue is whether you can use that force in the right place at the right time to have the deterrent or defence effect that you might want to achieve. NATO still has a massive reform and adaptation agenda ahead of it, which the UK is at the heart of. How does it position itself in cyberspace, in space, on hybrid questions? How does it think about the rise of China as not just a economically strategic player, but as a militarily and politically strategic player? So that is a really big agenda for European security within NATO that the UK has to carry on leaning into, and that should be shaping our approach to our integrated review. I think the second big theme for us will be our bilateral or minilateral relationships around Europe. Now, these have always been there. Many areas of cooperation have always been outside NATO or outside any multilateral framework. But I think there is a trend which is not just about the UK, actually. I think you're seeing it more generally, towards a deepening of these relationships. So the most salient one for us within Europe is with France, and we have the 10th anniversary of the Lancaster House Treaty being celebrated this year. Some very, very sensitive elements like nuclear cooperation that President Macron referred to in his remarkable speech last week, but also some very operational elements like the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, which I don't know, it was probably invented when you were CDS. The most capable expeditionary force that exists within Europe. And I think we'll want to push on with some of the really important capability cooperation that we do with France, like future maritime missiles, minesweeping systems, etc. I would say that the partnership with Germany is also picking up. We really felt that when the German defense minister was here 10 days ago. There's some big capability and industrial elements to that, for example, with the Rheinmetall BAE systems link up. But also the fact that we are the two big European allies who really try and put NATO first in our planning and our force planning. So I think the Germany-UK relationship is on an uptick. UK-Sweden being brought together by the Tempest project for the next generation of fighter aircraft. And then the one I would really highlight as being of a lot of interest at the moment is the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is where the UK comes together in effect as a framework nation for the Northern European countries, the 3 Baltic countries, the Scandinavian countries, including 2 non-NATO countries, Sweden and Finland, which is really all about making sure that those countries can react quickly and decisively in a crisis in Northern Europe and bring their respective capabilities to bear in an effective way. So I think you are going to see more of this kind of cooperation, both in the operational planning space, but also in the capability development space. And I think we are all very conscious that it has to be done in a way that reinforces NATO. And I think that is something which is by and large welcomed and accepted. And then lastly, you have the future relationship between the UK and the EU itself. Now, and I speak as somebody who's spent much of my career trying to make European defence work in one form or another. I think the UK is always going to value the role that the EU can play in building broader stability. It has a diplomatic role, it has a development role, it has a crisis management role that it can play. And I think that's an important part of European security, and the UK will want to encourage that. We're also open to friendly cooperation as a very like-minded friend and partner of the EU. How exactly that will be brought together is something that we will see emerge from the negotiations between the UK and the EU over the next couple of months and however long these things take. What I would say, though, is that our approach to this tends to be that in the foreign policy and defence space, partners just get on with things and they cooperate together in a pragmatic, sensible way. This probably isn't an area where you need some kind of overarching treaty sort of binding and fixing everything in place. This is probably an area where the pressure will just be to get on and do things together where the need so dictates. There may have to be some legal agreements underpinning parts of that, but it's not something where you need to have a big overarching agreement. I think the last point I just make on the EU is this is not like a independent third country deciding to have a relationship with NATO, because you know exactly what NATO does, what its aspirations are, where it's going, etc. We don't really know that about where the European Union is on defence. That's particularly true on industrial cooperation, where we know the EU has aspirations to build its role in industrial cooperation. We don't know whether it wants to do that with international partners or not. And so far, actually, the signals are that it's very cautious about any kind of cooperation with international partners, and it's actually trying to set up something which is more protectionist than open. That'll be a decision for the EU, really, and whether it's Britain or Norway or Australia or Japan or the US or any of the kind of like-minded countries out there who might want to work with the EU in future, I think we're all in the same position of kind of waiting to see what the EU itself wants.
Thank you. Can I just kick off? You both spoke about the primacy of NATO, and I wanted to ask 2 questions about that. Firstly, I just wanted to cast back to an interview that Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, did last month with the Sunday Times, in which he sort of suggested that the UK and by extension, I suppose, the rest of Europe perhaps can't fully rely on the US, which is moving in a more isolationist direction in terms of its foreign policy and has been seen to be an unreliable ally, particularly in terms of the shock announcement about the troop drawdown in Syria last autumn and in the strike on Qasem Soleimani in Iran at the beginning of the year. So my first question to both of you would be, shouldn't the UK be looking to really enhance and deepen European defence, given that there seems to be these concerns, expressed at the highest political level in the UK about the US and their reliability? And secondly, if I could just ask you both to sort of touch on the EU moves, I think particular concerns around France potentially wanting the European Defence Fund, PESCO, to act as rival or parallel structures outside of NATO rather than within the fold.
Do you want me to go first? I can't recall the detail of Ben Wallace's speech, and I don't know the degree to which some of the emphasis of it may or may not have been misreported. But I think that what he was talking about there is that the current US administration, reflecting quite a lot of Middle America, as I just hinted at in what I said, are slightly running out of patience with Europe not pulling its weight within NATO in return in terms of the amount of money invested and capability generated. So I think that what the Secretary of State for Defence was attempting to articulate here is that Europe needs to prove to America that it is prepared to do more to keep NATO healthy and relevant in order to continue to bind in America's membership of, enablement of and support to NATO. I don't think that there can be any sense that Europe can go it alone without America. And I was saying when we sort of got involved in Libya under David Cameron, and it was effectively the UK and the French, it very quickly became apparent, we already knew it, the French suddenly learned it, is that it is impossible to conduct a sophisticated air campaign with all the clearances, the communications, the airspace and all that, without defaulting to the command and control machinery that by and large America provides to run NATO. So I think this is not, it's been misinterpreted as an either or. It's more a case of Europe needs to be very wary that it has got to continue to deserve the integrated support of America, or we'll be in a bit of a mess. So we need to help ourselves a bit more. The idea that, almost for the reasons I've just said it, the idea that Europe could produce an armed forces that was, as it were, a rival to NATO is complete nonsense because of the thing I just said. The strategic,
but it undermines it by being a separate.
Well, and that's why, in many respects, we've got to make certain that any EU pretension for a security and defence policy has got to stay in the appropriate regional lane and not attempt, as it were, to supplant or rival the NATO command structures, because that would be foolhardy.
Angus, if I can ask you those same questions.
Yeah, so I don't think the Secretary of State was in any way calling into question American reliability. I think what he was doing was drawing attention to the fact that the US itself is stretched, and the Americans would be the first to say that. And the US cannot be everywhere all the time. It bears the bulk of responding to the rising military power of China. So I think it is a perfectly legitimate question for the UK and others to ask. Are there some areas where we'd want a bit more capability to do things ourselves without having to rely on American enablers, for example, if those American enablers are busy elsewhere? And I think that's the kind of question you would ask going into any defence review. But there are other questions you ask at the same time. Just as you may want a bit more autonomy in one area, you may actually recognise that in another area, probably we need to invest in more interoperability with the Americans, because actually, we need to keep up with them and be able to do things with them. And there may be a third set of issues where actually it's about whether we need to invest more in bringing more capability to a broader Western alliance that the Americans happen to underpin. I mean, space would be an interesting example there, where there's a plausible case that Britain, France, Germany and others, we all need to bring a bit more to what the Americans do, because they face such challenges there. On the EU, so I always try and divide it into kind of three possible kinds of things the EU could be doing. There are some things in the security and defence space which the EU does, which a friendly NATO-focused country like us should have absolutely no problem with whatsoever. If the EU is supporting capacity building in sub-Saharan Africa, what's to worry about that? It's not a role that NATO has ever aspired to take on. It's a perfectly good piece of burden sharing, if you like. Then there are maybe some areas where the EU promoting cooperation is a good thing if it's done in the right way, if it's not duplicatory, if it's open to partnership with non-EU countries. And we touched earlier on industrial cooperation. And then there's probably a handful of things that you just, from a NATO perspective, you just really wouldn't want the EU doing. And, for example, my personal view would be for the EU to have an Article 5 in the NATO sense of the word, or the article, which was in direct competition with the NATO one. I think that would be deeply confusing and create problems for NATO. So I think you just, rather than sort of say, anything the EU does is in tension with NATO, I think you need to look carefully at what the EU is doing and whether that is something which in the end complements and reinforces NATO or is in competition with it.
Thank you. I'll open the floor to questions. Shashank.
Thank you. Shashank Joshi with The Economist. Angus, just to pick up where you left off on the question of not knowing precisely what what form EU defence integration will take. One aspect of that is sub-regional focus and different sort of security regions within Europe. For a few years after 2014, we were all focused very much on the Baltics, but in recent years there's been a sort of flourishing of interest in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, in the Black Sea, North Atlantic, with reinforcements and all of those things. Is it possible, just as you said, European security is fundamental in the first priority, is there some sort of prioritisation you could give to how the UK sees all of those different theatres? Is that possible? Is there a way in which we can make ourselves most useful by focusing on some of those areas over others, and at the expense of some others? So what would we do less of? Finally, on Article 5, I mean, the EU does have a mutual security clause, as you know, and I'm interested in whether you think that in itself actually then therefore competes with NATO. I mean, it is a mutual defence clause, really, and Macron has said he wants to strengthen it. So if you could elaborate on that point, that would be very interesting.
Thank you.
So as a Foreign Office career official working in defence, inevitably I spent my first 6 months in defence wandering around asking people questions about geographical prioritisation. And it's taken me a good year to work out that actually, by and large, that's not how defence thinks. It's true that we are more focused on the Baltic than we are on Southwest Africa. At some level, you're right. But actually, if you look at the way, in particular, European security is now working, what you realise is that the threats don't think in neat geographical boxes like that, and that something happening in the Baltic can be linked to something that's happening in the Black Sea, especially if Russia is behind it. That threats that originate in sub-Saharan Africa end up becoming a problem in the central Mediterranean. Equally, if you look at cyberspace or space or information warfare, then these things are geographically agnostic. I think it probably is fair to say that the UK will always be focused on the Atlantic, will always be focused on the North Atlantic space, will always be focused on Northern Europe. But the Mediterranean and indeed quite, both East and West Africa and the Gulf, these regions all have a pull on us. So I think there's a long way of saying, no, I can't give you a neat prioritization, and I think I would resist the argument to give a neat prioritization. And in fact, and it's one of the reasons NATO talks about 360 posture, trying to get away from the idea that there's a kind of zero-sum between the East and the South, or the North and the West, or whatever. And on the EU in Article 5, so it's true the EU has a mutual solidarity clause, but it also makes clear that for those member states who are members of NATO, the defence part of that is enacted through NATO. And it's also not, read it carefully, it does not say the same things as NATO's Article 5 for very good reasons, not least the fact that the UK was a member state of the European Union when it was agreed.
Thank you.
John Wilson, a member of RUSI and various other military tanks and a writer. I was deeply disturbed to hear from General Lord Houghton that without America, NATO would be impotent and not able to fight on its own in Western Europe. When you think that Russia has a fraction of the GDP of even Britain, let alone the rest of the NATO Western nations, it seems to be outrageous. My question is this: how can this country hope to defend itself when Russia has the SSC-8 intermediate nuclear-capable hypersonic missile, to which you, my lord, have said we have no defence? How fearful should we be?
Perhaps if I mean, it is a fact that the operational command levels of NATO are primarily enabled by American capability in terms of being able to clear the airspace, secure air supremacy, make certain that the electronic warfare dimension of that is clear for us to fly offensive missions safely. They can be done without risk, but in the sort of nature of combat that we would want to conduct at an operational level, you need some highly sophisticated enablement of that. That's not to say you couldn't fight, but you'd be daft with America as part of your alliance not to ensure that that was the case. And those subsets of, if you like, sanitizing, particularly the air domain, of how you then conduct. We haven't I don't think we've fought any form of conflict where we have not enjoyed air supremacy for decades. And it's frightening to think about the realities of contested airspace. And we would have to give that some serious, as would politicians, before embarking on such a thing. So I put that in its... The second part of the question was, this particular... Frank Gardner raised a similar question a couple of weeks ago. And it's true that you've identified a capability which is not yet fielded, as I understand it, as a tested capability. I might be wrong on this.
No, I think you're right.
I don't read Jane's Defence Weekly on a monthly basis. I do more historical novels as the Constable of the Tower. But nevertheless, that you are talking about, you're no more than, dare I say it, sensationalising one element of a force-on-force superiority in the nature of that being a continuous fact of military history. That one side will have something that has an edge on another, the other side will have an edge on that. What I do think, and if this becomes very rapidly fielded technology, then it does present a specific danger to some of our capabilities that we need to be very, very sober about, either in developing capabilities to defeat them, or ensuring we don't get into the circumstances where such a weapon is used. And so they become another factor in the business of mutual deterrence, mutual risk and all that. But trying to elevate this remarkably sexy sounding piece of kit as if it now holds the whole of the West to ransom, frankly, is for the birds.
Thank you. Just a brief word on that. Building on next point on the missile. So when Russia developed this missile, which led to the collapse of the INF Treaty, a lot of the debate was about the impact on arms control. And the impact on arms control is a serious one that we need to work on. But in some ways, what Russia did was kind of lift the veil a bit on an issue which Europeans as a whole probably ought to have been thinking about a bit more somewhere, which is the way in which Russia uses missiles in the European theatre to hold us at risk. And I completely agree with the General that it's not just the one missile. I mean, there are short-range Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad and things like that. And I think this has provoked a bit of a debate in NATO about, do we have the posture right to deal with this? In fact, the UK has put some ideas around NATO just this week on that. And the answer, as is so often the case in defence, is likely to be quite complex. You know, there are going to be lots of different things that we can do to make sure that our posture takes into account properly the nature of the threat that the Russians are holding over us, of which the most obvious is that, you know, we hold threats over the other side too, and that's how military alliances work.
Yes, chap here.
Just before.
Could you say who you are?
Yeah, my name is Alan Lee Williams. I'm chairman of the Atlantic Council of the UK and a former MP. Henry Kissinger, shortly after he retired, spoke to a group of members of Parliament, which included the European end of the members of Parliament, as it were. It wasn't just British. And he said, we've had a lot of crises, he said, in NATO. We have a crisis every week, and it doesn't disturb the organisation. But there is a big one coming. Very big, he emphasised. And it will come from an American president. He said he probably will be Republican, but it could also be a Democrat. And it'd be about money. He said, now what Europe should be doing, thinking of doing, is switching NATO's top people so that the political post will go to an American. He would be Secretary General of NATO. And the other post would be the chief military one, would go to an American. Now, a European, yes. Now, it's been buzzing around my head for a long time. I didn't think very much of the proposal when it was made, and I still don't think it's a very good proposal now. Now is not the time to be worried about what Henry Kissinger said, but I'd be interested to hear whether, if the events had been the other way around, would we have agreed to a change of that nature, of the top people in NATO?
I'm not certain I've absorbed that with full clarity about what jobs for what nations within what elements of either the political construct or the military construct of NATO. I know from the military side it is quite cleverly balanced. I mean, it's called star counts. And you always have a non-American chair of the military committee, and you always have an American who is the strategic allied commander Europe. You always, though there was a time, within then the command group of NATO, from SACEUR, you then either have the DSACEUR or the COSA, and there's four stars in there, and they cover the major contributors. And then as you flow down through the NATO command structure, there's an ensured that there is a balance of star count across all the nations. And to me, I don't see why you would seek to change that. And I don't see, but equally, I don't see why sensible changes would destabilise it. If you're then going to the political elements of this and who the Secretary-General is, well, at the end of the day, although it is a highly influential post, he is but the Secretary. He is the convening power and the Secretariat that actually, when NATO meets, it's the heads of state of the NATO nations. And therefore he acts as the conductor of the orchestra of the national inputs. I have to say I've attended 2 NATO summits, gloriously in Cardiff and Warsaw, quite close quarters. And it's always pretty clear from the dynamics of the room about who the most important voices are. That's not to say that everybody's voice doesn't have relevance, but in terms of the major decisions and all, so I don't really recognise from what, unless Henry Kissinger was alluding to something that you've perhaps not conveyed with his normal clarity, why any tinkering, as it were, with the command structure or the secretariats will at all upset the actual powers which are vested in the countries and their representation at various levels, from military to defence minister to foreign secretary to a full plenary heads of state. On that issue, I'm resting relatively easy in my bed.
On that theme of personnel and how that sort of feeds into integration, do you think we have the right level regarding the US and the UK at present? I know we have a deputy commander of one of our divisions is an American. Should we try and bind America in or boost interoperability with more kind of personnel exchanges?
I think we're quite healthy on that. Just in case a question isn't sort of asked on this, I'll use that to give an answer that I think is perhaps more relevant to, if I can be so sort of cheeky, is that NATO itself has gone walkabout in terms of efficiency. When I was in the 70s, when I was a subaltern guarding Hesse in Berlin and things, about 2/3 of the British Army were committed to the deterrence of the Soviet bloc. And we all had a place, a trench, a tank in which we went to fight. We knew it was GDP, the General Defence Plan, whatever. Once the Cold War had ended, and we then embarked on a series of new NATO members, there wasn't the same requirement for a fixed deterrent posture, and many of, dare I say, the new members, or some of the older ones, didn't have military capability that was genuinely state-of-the-art. So in modernising defence for a whole period of time, they went on what was this glorified force generation mechanism, which wasn't a mechanism to produce deterrence or an operational posture, but it was one that simply to improve the level of capability of the forces. And so, for example, I don't know, Angus, you might know, do we now have 9 or 12 core headquarters in NATO at various states of readiness? We used to just have the Ark, and then we have all these other ones. So there is a ridiculous amount of capability that is squandered on this massive force generation mechanism, which takes about 4 years to get ready, to be 6 months on task, and then it has another 4 years to rest. This is no way to run an efficient organisation. Now, what I'm saying is, as we revisit efficiencies of scale, we won't find them through the alchemy of revisiting the procurement methods of Abbey Wood. We'll find a bit, but it'll be the loose change. It is genuinely, and Angus outlined some of the initiatives, but they've not got fire. They're sort of, they accepted just about the level that everybody will tick, rather than saying, no, we really need to force generate NATO as if it, because it is, actively in a deterrent posture with resilience all the time, which will free up other resources to do other things. But we're not there at the moment, and to be honest, and again, I've borne witness to some of these meetings, NATO summits, and you've never really walked away with the sense, yes, they've all got that, things are now going to change. You know, it's a more, and I think that's where we've got to go. And I think that we need to do it now for, dare I say, the state of our own armed forces. And then there can be some specialisations with the things that Angus mentioned, the CJEF and the JEF. They're very good initiatives that have happened. But things like that need to now actually get more and more steam in them from more and more, dare I say, professional, did I call it, exemplars of professional military body, which the UK still is. Don't get me wrong, but everybody needs to get with the same agenda, which they don't. There's a lot of freeloaders out there.
Just 2 points. One on the Secretary General point. I mean, I'm just about now recovered from having organised a NATO summit a couple of months ago here in London, and the role played by a very political European Secretary General was absolutely critical. And I think there is something about having a Secretary General who can coalesce the European political view and then have a meaningful conversation with an American president about how you then land that at a summit. And he did that superbly well. And I think, just to pick up General Nick's point on exemplars, I think you're going to see a really good one in what's happening now, which is the US Defender 20 exercise, where the US Army is bringing an entire armoured division across the Atlantic, dumping it on the coast of Europe and driving it to where it needs to go to exercise, just to sort of show itself, but also, I think, in many ways, to show Europeans this is what still needs to be done from time to time, and you need to be set up to do it, and you need to have the bridges in place, and you need to have the logistics in place, and this is what being serious means. And I think that's a really, well, it also cuts to this constant narrative of, oh, the Americans are leaving Europe. Well, it won't look as though they're leaving Europe over the next few weeks.
No, 20,000 US troops landing on our soil. Take a couple of questions now, just to get as many people in as possible. Yes, the lady there.
Thank you. I'm interested in General Lofton's comments about megatrends. I believe the megatrend issue is not just in the UK, but across the globe. And everyone is concerned about this megatrend. And there are countries that look at addressing this issue through concepts like total defense, where they bring the whole of society and the whole of government together in addressing this issue, not, as you just addressed, just not defense, but other stakeholders as well. So how does the UK see this in the light of considering the concept of total defense? Thank you.
It's a good question. I mean, this is what I hope will come out of an integrated diplomatic development and defence review. Because I think, quite rightly, that there is every good reason to worry more about the implications of megatrends as there is actually malevolent state actors. And certainly when it comes to, and this is why I played my few opening remarks, into the relative disadvantage in the world, the problems of population growth, the climate control and all that, is the recognition that none of these can be resolved by single nations. They can only be resolved by collective international action. And therefore, I think that if the UK is defining its role in the world, now it might only be the second soft power in the world at the moment, but I still think that it has got an awful lot going for it, again, in terms of professional leadership within international institutions, hosting climate control conferences, all these things. And I would hope to think, rather than say it, and you might find it surprising for a military man, rather than, cling to the totemic capabilities of a great historic military power, elements of which are a myth of our own invention. If we're wanting to redefine it, make certain that what we do militarily is exemplary because it's properly resourced and professional, but the great strengths of our country lay in many of these other things which are far more to do with diplomacy and development and values and our ability to sort of hold a mirror up to others and make them accountable. Because I think we do all now recognise that these things are not going to be resolved by the power of prayer. They're going to be resolved by the power of collective action. So I hope that's what we're heading for. Not some sloppy idea about what we cut and what we save and how good the procurement system at Abbey Wood's working this week.
I've got to pick up on that because it's the second time you've suggested that any sort of major overhaul of procurement would be a waste of time. I just wanted to throw that horrible question to you, Angus.
I think this is when historians say, not my period. But look, I mean, it's just as every defence review has to look at what are our priorities in the world, every defence review looks at, are we going about buying things in the right way? I think what we are seeing quite a lot of focus on the defence industry in Britain, and have we got the relationship right? Whether it's in terms of how we buy things from the industry or where the industry itself is going, and is it in the right place to make sure that it's still generating the capabilities we need in Britain in 20, 30, 40 years' time, which will be quite different to today. So I think those kind of issues will be part of the review, but I don't have any great insights beyond that to offer.
Give me another two. There's a world of difference between a review of procurement and a review of a defence industrial strategy. Procurement is just about, what's the optimum way of the shop buying the customer's gear? And keep fiddling around with that. There are only so many ways you can do it. But if you're never certain what you want to buy and you've never got enough money for it, then shopping is a difficult task. So resolve it in that way. At its Billy Basics, it's very simple. Defence industrial strategy, though, there's all sorts of potential gain to be made, perils to be run, risks to be, advantages to be resourced. We've lived probably too long in submitting the UK defence industrial base to the sort of the Thatcherite competitive market. If you can't do it for next to nothing, then we're going to get it somewhere else. It's all competition. Virtually alone in the world, we failed to protect a UK defence industrial base. And although I think there's some very good work, I understand, Angus, going on this within the Ministry of Defence, we've never thoroughly understood the benefit to the domestic economy of the UK of spending money and protecting our own market. Now then, the fact is, the market is already something of a globalised one, and therefore it's not as if you can just sort of draw a sovereign line around all your capability. But certainly, and I still think, and the platforms now, will we ever build another tank? I don't think we've got the capability. Ships, yes, we can still build sort of some of that. But within the technological base of our defence industry, where we're world leading in some of that, and we ought to be protecting, trading, investing a huge amount in the technological edge that the technological part of the defence industrial base of this country could be world leading at. So in that sort of a strategy, I'm absolutely for, and is definitely worth being a major part of whatever this review is.
Great. Right, I'll take two more quick questions and two quick answers. So perhaps chap here and the chap there.
Thank you, Mr. Nicol-Gent. I'm a long-term member of this, and Lord Houghton mentioned the myth, of which I used to be part of, possibly like a good many others around here, having spent most of my time in the 50s and 60s afloat east of Suez. The Mediterranean in those days was regarded as somewhere you did your quarterly full power trial in order to get back in time before the 364th day of your deployment. Caused some trouble for the Treasury. We've talked about defence in Britain and Europe. It says underneath subtitle, in the world. We've not heard very much about the world, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Josh Arnold-Forster. I'm going to use an army example, but it could be a navy or an air force example. If you cut the size of the British Army from 82,000 to 65,000, what would you need to do to deliver the same capability? What kind of technology, what kind of Dominic Cummings type, wonderful fairy dust would do that?
Can I just have final thoughts from you, Angus?
And I'll do the size of the army.
I might just leave the army to an expert. So look, on the world, if you look at what we've been doing in defence for the last couple of years, we are trying to be a bit more present in parts of the world that perhaps we haven't done so much of in the last 20 years or so. So, for example, putting a consistent flow of Royal Naval ships into the Pacific through the South China Sea, deepening our relationships with Japan, with Australia, with India, having a permanent presence in the Gulf of a frigate, in addition to the minesweeping and things like that we've done for a while. And I think that trend, is likely to continue, because if you look at where the threats to the international rules-based system are, where you look at where our allies also think they need to put their effort, US, Australia, France in particular, I think that pull is quite strong. What the review allows us to do is to take a step back and really analyse, where do we think the demand is coming from, and do we have the right capability mix to do that? Because I think, as General Nick will remember, quite a lot of the time at the moment, you have a force designed to do one thing, which you then bend out of shape in order to go off and do something that it wasn't quite planned for. And that's probably always the nature of defence, because you always have a force designed for whatever you thought your problem was 20 years ago. But this is why you have reviews. It's a moment to take stock and say, can we match that global ambition and global responsibilities with the force?
Just on the size of armies, or navies and air force, I think it's very dangerous to judge the capability of an army, navy or air force through the input metric of numbers of things. And manpower is particularly difficult, because I know armies where they have huge sounding numbers, but they also contain in their Olympic sports team in there, or more mess waiters than you can cooks that you can throw a hat at. So there are different approaches to counting your numbers. By and large, we are moving I think in the British Army, to more, those that we've got are the sort of the Jedi Knights of military capability. Most of them are useful in deploying and operating their machinery and kit and all the rest of it in a manner that goes to slay the Queen's enemies, if I can sort of bluntly put it in sort of historic terms. So we are, in manpower terms, quite efficient. There is no doubt about it that there will be increasing evolution to autonomy and robotics to do lots of the dodgy jobs, some of the old attritional jobs, and that's, to be honest, wholly right. So you probably will see the ability to bring regular manpower levels down as autonomy and robotics and manless flight, unmanned drones and all that sort of takes off. The third thing, which I had some part of, but I still don't sense we've fully embraced it yet, is the exploitation of the reserve. The reserves have still seemed to be this sort of Cold War idea that when the balloon eventually goes up, they start to crank into action. Whereas, given the nature of particularly of the security dimension of the threats at the moment, the skill sets that we need are by and large at scale out in the reserve. Lots of the cybernauts, if I can call them that, a ridiculous, huge amount of the medical capability can only maintain its skill sets in the reserves. So I don't know whether or not, when I launched a review in 2010 about the reserves and the future reserves, and I think the numbers are now healthier than the regulars, but I still think that we, in terms of the evolution of the whole force, I think that there is still some games to be played in the scale of the reserves as regards the scale in the on-tap regulars at a given moment. But please do get away from just seeing it through the input metric of numbers, because we're not dealing with like from like, either historically or across comparator nations.
Well, thank you. I notice we've just run a couple of minutes over time, so we'll have to draw it to a close there. But please join me in thanking Lord Houghton and Angus Lapsley. Thank you.